Hello and a very warm welcome. I'm on Kazmi and you're watching Voicepk.net, Pakistan's first human rights portal reporting on women, children, and minorities. Anti government protests in Iran continue to rage on following the death of Mahsa Amini, who was detained for allegedly breaking rules on headscarf. To speak on this issue today, we're joined today with Mahsa Alimardani, who is a senior researcher on the MENA region with the Freedom of Expression Organization Article 19 and is a doctoral candidate at the University of Oxford Internet Institute. Mahsa is of both Canadian and Iranian nationality, having grown up living between Canada, Iran, Belgium, and Taiwan. She is current, she currently lives in the United Kingdom. Thank you, Mahsa, for joining the program.
Thanks for having me. I'm joining you from a short visit to Canada, actually, but it's great to be on this show.
And we're glad you could join us. So, Mahsa, if you could just help us understand what is happening in Iran right now.
Yeah, so we are actually reaching the 1 month anniversary of the death of a young Kurdish Iranian woman who died through what seems to be likely blunt force trauma to the head, caused by the morality police who had detained her for wearing improper hijab. I mean, she was wearing hijab, but they had deemed it improper. And so while in custody, she received such trauma to the head that she went into a coma for 2 days. And after 2 days, she passed away. And right away, this was a spark that really ignited just decades of grievances across the country. The spark has been ignited for different reasons before throughout the past 10 years in Iran. But this time around, the resonance of the mistreatment of women, the unequal and systematic laws that, enshrine gender inequality has hit home across an entire nation. And of course, this has been largely defined as a women-led movement, but it has sparked grievances and outrage on all levels of human rights, from minorities, from political prisoners, from issues of freedom of expression. This has really become, over 4 weeks of national protests. And even today, we had announcements in Tehran for more strikes to occur today. And so we're actually experiencing a very severe internet disruptions and shutdowns across the country as we speak, as the authorities are trying to still quell what's going on.
It's interesting that you mentioned, the protest before, because we have, seen especially female protesters come in 1979, in 2009, and more recently in 2019. But nothing like this, nothing to this scale. What makes these protests so different?
Of course, yes. In 1979, when mandatory hijab was announced, there were protests right away by women, because women were at the forefront of the revolution against the Shah. They were also at the forefront of protesting what happened in terms of enshrining gender equality right away with the new system that was put in place. So what we are seeing is 4 decades of grievances. I mean, we had, the initial decade of the Islamic Revolution saw very severe repression, saw very traumatic events actually take place throughout Iran. So, once the revolution took place, the new regime clamped down pretty hard. And so I'm not sure if this is a history that people know very well, but it is a history that, is part of the collective trauma, I think, of a nation, which is the 1988 massacres that occurred, which was, political prisoners were rounded up who were not on the side of the new regime, who were not on the side of Ayatollah Khomeini and his allies once the revolution had cemented itself. And so political prisoners were rounded up. And by 1988, there was a fatwa to commit mass executions of all of these political prisoners. And so there have been multiple events to document these crimes. I know, many people from my, the generation of my parents who live with the knowledge of what happened. They had friends who were executed. They knew tons of people. If people were in jail at the time and happened to escape, this is a trauma that has been lived through that generation. And of course, we had, the Iran-Iraq war that took place throughout the majority of those of the 80s. And so these are very traumatic events. And so, throughout the 90s and 2000s, of course, there were protests, but there was never anything on the scale of, the courage and bravery that we're seeing now. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, this is a protest that's being largely led by this generation that is very disconnected from that initial trauma and pain of the 80s, of the beginning of the revolution. And so we are seeing the bravery of these young people, who are about 3 generations now removed from the revolution. Of course, during 2009, we had these protests, and the protests were very much for the right to vote, why, the Green movement, or why, the reformist candidates that were very popularly campaigning did not win, with, allegations of election fraud to bring in the more conservative and populist Ahmadinejad. And so the reason for the 2009 protests were very different. There was, very severe repression, but there was nothing on the scale that we're seeing here. It was quickly quelled. The amount of deaths was, paled in comparison to what we had seen later. And of course, then, economic grievances have just gotten worse in Iran. And so from 2017 onwards, we have seen bursts of protests that have been a combination of dissatisfaction with how, the economy is being run, the corruption, and the inflation, and the severe forms of poverty that just seem to increase across the nation. Meanwhile, the elites keep on getting richer, and the corruption is just very palpable throughout the country. And so, in 2017, 2018, we saw the economy be the reason for the ignition of the protests. But again, the protests eventually, the slogans and what we hear from the streets eventually come to the same themes, which is, like death to Khamenei, death to the dictator, down with the Islamic Republic. So whatever the sparks are, it comes down to these basic grievances that this state is mistreating its people. And so we saw the same thing in 2019. Again, the spark for the 2019 protests were price hikes and fuel. So again, it was an economic reason for the ignition of those protests. And so we saw, we don't even know the scale of the deaths that occurred in 2019, and the 2019 protests occurred for a much shorter period than we're seeing right now. And so, there's estimates that the death toll is anywhere between 1,500 or even more. In terms of verification, it's been very hard to verify what happened during the 2019 protests. Of course, there was internet shutdowns that occurred, and this documentation has been very difficult. And of course, the state has made sure that documentation and verification of the crimes they committed is very difficult. And so we're now here in 2022. The issue of hijab and women's rights sparked these protests. But again, and even though women are at the forefront and Gen Z is at the forefront of these protests, it is very much, again, a universal theme of human rights for, all pockets of society: men, women, the queer community, ethnic minority communities, religious minority communities, and how all of these different segments of Iranian society are systematically being denied basic human rights. And we are seeing that ongoing. And of course, it's been ongoing to, 2 factors, which is the complete frustration of this population against the state, who will not budge, who will not move an inch in terms of giving freedoms or human rights or being accountable for any of their actions. And the fact that we do really have a generation that's at the forefront of these protests that seems to really be acting with total lack of fear in terms of having to deal with the impunity and brutality of the Islamic Republic.
Yes. And you're right, the images that we're seeing of just not just women, but young people is really captivating. But I would say this, there's also been a crackdown at, schools and universities, including at the Sharif University campus. Iran's education minister, Yusuf Nouri, confirmed that some students are being sent to psychological institutes for reform and re education to what they term is antisocial behavior. So, why do you think these young people from schools and universities are specifically being targeted? And what is motivating them to, still join the protests given the danger?
So these young people are completely disconnected and disaffected by this system. And so they are very much at the forefront because they see no future and no hope within the structures of the Islamic Republic. And of course, this is extremely frightening for the Islamic Republic because they are seeing the very foundations of the next, 2-3 decades in the very shape and form of the things and protests of these young people. And so why are they cracking down? Why are they taking them to re-education camps? Because that's how they must survive. That's how the next few decades of their power will be shaped, which is by the nature and form of, the courage or protest of these young people. And what they are doing to these children is some of the most harrowing crimes that we are seeing being committed. I mean, we have only seen 23 verified cases of the Islamic Republic actually killing children, but these numbers are expected to be much, much higher. And I cannot understand how anyone can watch these videos of security forces entering these schools, attacking these children and rounding them up and systematically killing them. I don't understand how anyone can be watching what's going on and not being affected by this brutality. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. But
No, you're completely lying. The images are horrifying, and we're seeing, little schoolgirls taking brave stances and protesting against politicians, against their teachers, against the system that's really holding them down. And it is heartening to see such passion and courage from young people from Iran, and that is really motivating and inspiring for everybody else around the world who's looking to Iran right now. But in terms of, you mentioned that there are economic reasons. But besides that, the center of the problem seems to be enforced hijab for women. And this is, really interesting because in other countries like India and France, women are being prevented from wearing the niqab. So, do you think the issue at the heart is patriarchal dominance in many ways?
of course, the patriarchal dominance and the male dominant centered structures of the Islamic Republic very much define the repression and the systems of harm that they have created. And of course, women have been very, very much at the forefront of the communities who have been harmed by this system. I mean, I've been hearing many conversations about, how can women in France be appealing to the struggles of Iranian women when they're not spending time on the violations of rights that occur in France against women who want to wear hijab. And that is a valid argument and a valid conversation, but to be perfectly frank with you, I think there's a time and place for the conversation of the rights of women to wear hijab. And of course, I work for an organization that has done much work on that, has analyzed the violations of human rights that France implements when they deny those rights. But I really think that this conversation next to what is happening in Iran is, however, a distraction, because, there's a lot of issues going on in the world. There are a lot of human rights abuses, and these conversations are right. But if we're here talking about Iran and the scale of, possibly atrocities that the Islamic Republic is committing right now, I really think this is distracting from the topic at hand. There is a massive problem when we are talking about Iran, and the massive problem is the fact that communication and access to this country is so severely limited. And so, this past Tuesday and Wednesday, there was a massive attack on Kurdistan, the province of Kurdistan, and there was, near total internet shutdown. And the documentation from the pockets of internet connectivity that have come out have indicated that, possible crimes against humanity could have occurred. But of course, because of the hurdles of communication, because of the hurdles the Islamic Republic puts in place to not allow human rights groups to document, to put pressure on families and victims not to document, the crimes that have occurred against them, it's even hard to understand the scale of criminality there. And so again, if we are trying to put this issue of potential massacres happening, massacres that can't even be documented, next to, human rights violating laws in France, I just don't think this is a conversation that should be put together. And of course, the issue of women's rights was the spark for this. And it is a massive part of the movement, of course, because it was initially a lot of discussions about the morality police and disabling the morality police. But, it's almost a month of what we're seeing in Iran, and it's so much more than just women's rights. Of course, women's rights is defining it. It's the slogan of the movement, which is, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, women, life, freedom. But, that slogan itself kind of describes what's going on, which is, women's rights defines everyone else's rights. Women's rights if you have women's rights, you will have queer rights, you will have minority rights, and you will have all of these different, basic human rights that are systematically denied within the system. And that's really what this is about. And the most concerning aspect of this right now is the right to life. And how the right to life is being systematically denied against anyone who wants to take up, the universal human right to protest. So that's really, I think, at the core of what we need to be talking about right now.
And do you think, speaking from, this perspective of censorship, especially internet censorship, because Iran has had such stringent laws, that it has allowed, protesters to bypass these rules and regulations and have other alternate ways to, get their voice heard?
So, we've been seeing various different forms of internet restrictions being put in place. And of course, this is a major issue during protests, in terms of documentation, in terms of getting awareness about what's going on. I think because there are sometimes economic reasons, and because they have changed tack. I mean, in 2019, we had a near total internet shutdown for over a week, and we haven't quite seen that right now in Iran. They've taken a different tack, whether it's for economic reasons, whether it's for, national efficiency. We've seen more, different types of internet disruptions, more severe forms of censorship. And so as a result, there has been pockets of connectivity, while mobile internet has, been experiencing curfews on certain days or been completely shut when there are protests in certain protest areas. We've been seeing like home Wi-Fi have been usually connected, but extremely unstable. I mean, today, I haven't been able to connect with anyone in Iran because it seems like there has been a major attack on the network, with most ISPs and internet service providers being disconnected for the past few hours in Iran. But it's not constant. There are pockets of connectivity, and of course, there's been severe attacks through the state to disable VPNs, and of course, disabling VPNs is a major issue because they've now censored almost every foreign platform, almost any platform where any kind of communication can occur outside of government oversight, and so there have been many hurdles, and so even tracking different protest networks that have been documenting what has been going on within the over 100 cities that have broken out in protests in Iran.
Yeah.
We have been seeing the footage get to them, but of course it takes longer. Someone goes out with a phone that's not connected to the internet, documents what's going on, and then finds their way to someone or somewhere where the internet is available, and they can upload it or send it to someone who can upload it. And so these hurdles exist, but the internet has been always introduced to Iranians as kind of a cat and mouse game since its introduction in terms of censorship and finding ways to circumvent that censorship. And so we're seeing that very much so take place with these protests. And the very fact that we can find pockets of connectivity has allowed us to have any kind of knowledge and information about what's going on. We can, there has been great work by Amnesty, by Harana, by various other human rights groups to actually try to verify and document these crimes in the limited forms that they can based on this digital evidence that is available through these pockets of internet connectivity. And of course, these groups have very refined methodologies to verify the digital evidence that's available. And so, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, of course, because that is the very limited information that's getting out.
So in this situation, what do you think, for those of us outside Iran, what can we do to, help the protesters, help amplify the voices of these human rights defenders and these women and children who, fighting for their lives right now?
I mean, like, speaking to a Pakistani audience right now, I think is an incredible opportunity for me to show you what's going on in Iran, because Pakistan as a state, its diplomats wield enormous power within various different international bodies. So the power that Pakistan wields within the United Nations, the power that Pakistan as a state wields as a potential partner or trade partner with Iran is enormous. So what kind of influence can Pakistani civil society put on the Pakistani state to ensure that Iran is being accountable and stops committing these crimes? So I think this is, I couldn't see a more important country or audience to speak to about this. So, I mean, while you might think that it's, ironic and silly that these French celebrities are, cutting their hair in these viral videos while not talking about what's happening with like the injustices in their own country. It's incredibly powerful and important because, the French state actually, French diplomats and French foreign policy has been very much aligned with, diplomacy and appeasing the Islamic Republic in order to get the nuclear deal done. And so, having that kind of media pressure on the French state to not concede and to apply more pressure to apply human rights accountability is extremely important. And I think the same thing applies in Pakistan. While these very silly forms of solidarity in terms of, okay, but why are we standing in solidarity in Iran and not standing in solidarity with X, Y, and Z country? No, this is extremely important because at the end of the day, there is no means for this government to be accountable. There is no stop for this government not to go and massacre its own people. It has done it before and it will continue to do it. And there really needs to be international pressure to stop this. And I'm not talking about, a war or intervention of that sort, but, different states have a responsibility to not just look away when the Islamic Republic is killing children. And so I really deplore anyone, any audience, to be paying attention to this and to be asking their governments, why aren't you doing anything? Why are you meeting with, members of the Islamic Republic of Iran and not condemning them for killing children.
Lastly, I would just want to ask, how do you see the future of Iran? Do you see, the government making concessions, or do you see that the stringent stress codes and the economic turmoil will continue?
Um, I mean, the only hope I see is, these brave young people who absolutely do not care. They do not care if they will be killed. And I mean, why? Why should young people be killed in order to stand up to this government? And so there's so much hope in that, but there's so much horror in that. And between the hope and the horror, I honestly don't know what to say. I don't know what to say because it does not seem that there is any kind of stop to this system. There is no accountability. They will continue killing people. And I have no idea where that line will be drawn in terms of where the brutality will end. So I honestly have no answer for that. I just hope that there is enough pressure and there is enough incentives for this government to see that they should stop killing their future. They should stop killing their youth. But I don't have much else to say in terms of what I think will happen.
No, and we completely, echo this, the sentiment, and we hope and pray that these protesters are able to, achieve some form of concessions, and the government really listens. And to, help that, we're hoping that international communities, like from Pakistan, as you said, our diplomats, our politicians also take a stance and, help the protesters in Iran. Thank you so much, Mahsa Alimardani, for joining Voicepk.net and for speaking to us about this very important issue.